Location: a frozen lake on the outskirts of Minnesota, where the cold isn't the only thing chilling to the bone. Some heroes aren't looking for glory. They just want to do the right thing. Where are you watching from, and what time is it? 12-year-old Jamal Carter was used to the cold, but nothing could prepare him for what he found that day. The air was crisp, his breath visible in front of him as he walked along the frozen lake. The ice beneath his feet groaned softly, but he had walked this path many times before. It was just another winter afternoon, until he spotted something unusual in the distance. 2 small figures huddled near the edge of the lake. Jamal's pace slowed. His heartbeat quickened as he moved closer. A little girl, no older than 6, sat shivering, her arms wrapped tightly around something. Her cheeks were red from the cold, her lips slightly blue. In her arms, wrapped in cloth, was a baby. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with fear. Her voice was weak, barely above a whisper. "Please, don't send us back." Jamal's breath hitched, his mind racing. He could see the desperation in her eyes, the way her small body trembled against the wind, his hands clenched at his sides. He had expected to take a quiet walk, not to stumble upon something so fragile, so terrifyingly real. The baby in her arms barely stirred. A tiny face peeked from beneath the fabric, its lips slightly parted, cheeks pale against the bitter cold. Jamal swallowed hard, his pulse hammering in his ears. The girl's arms tightened around the infant, as if she feared he might take them away. Her body curled instinctively, shielding the baby from the elements. Her eyes never left his, pleading, waiting. Jamal's chest felt heavy. He had never been in a situation like this before, never been faced with something so urgent. Every second that passed felt like a weight pressing against him, demanding that he do something, anything. The wind howled around them, sending ice crystals dancing across the frozen lake. The cold was sharp, biting at his exposed skin, but he barely noticed. His focus remained on the children in front of him. His throat tightened. What had happened to them? Why were they here, alone, in the freezing cold? The fear in the girl's voice lingered in his mind. "Don't send us back." The words repeated, stirring something deep inside him. His breath came out uneven as he crouched slightly, making himself less imposing. "It's okay," he said, his voice softer now. "I'm not here to hurt you." The girl didn't move, didn't blink. Her grip on the baby remained firm, her small frame still curled protectively around the bundle in her arms. Jamal exhaled slowly, his own hands shaking, though not from the cold. The weight of the moment pressed against his chest, an unspoken urgency demanding action. He didn't know what had happened to them. But he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't just walk away. "What do you think happened to them? Let's discuss." Jamal's heart pounded as he crouched beside them. "Hey, it's okay. I won't hurt you." The girl clutched the baby tighter, her small arms trembling. Her wide eyes darted past him, scanning the trees as if expecting someone to appear. "Are you with them?" she whispered, her voice hoarse from the cold. Jamal shook his head, his breath visible in the freezing air. "I don't know who they are, but I need to get you both somewhere warm." The girl hesitated, her grip on the baby tightening. She seemed to weigh his words, the fear in her eyes battling with the possibility of trust. Jamal could see the exhaustion etched into her face, the way her body slumped under the weight of both fatigue and fear. Carefully, he reached out. "I promise, I just want to help." She didn't move, didn't speak, but she didn't pull away either. Jamal slowly peeled back a corner of the cloth wrapped around the baby. His breath caught in his throat. The infant's lips were turning blue, its tiny body limp against the girl's chest. Panic surged through him. There was no time to waste. "We need to go. Now," Jamal said, his voice urgent. The girl didn't argue. She just stared at him, her expression unreadable. But he could see the truth in her eyes. She knew the baby was in danger. Jamal reached into his jacket pocket, his fingers fumbling as he pulled out his gloves. "Here, put these on," he said, his voice softer now, more controlled despite the fear gnawing at his chest. She hesitated again, but when the coal bit at her fingers, she took them and slipped them on. They were too big, swallowing her small hands, but at least they were something. The wind howled around them, biting through Jamal's coat, making every exposed inch of skin burn. His breath came out in uneven puffs as he glanced around. The lake stretched behind them, a frozen sheet of white, offering no shelter, no warmth. Trees loomed nearby, their branches coated in ice, stark against the gray sky. Jamal knew they couldn't stay here. The baby wouldn't last much longer in this cold. He bent lower, keeping his voice as calm as possible. "Can you walk?" The girl nodded slowly, but her movements were stiff, sluggish. She had been out here too long. "Okay," Jamal said, glancing down at the baby again. Its breaths were faint, its tiny chest barely rising and falling. His stomach twisted. He had to move now. "I need you to stay close to me," he told her, his voice firm but gentle. "We're going to find help." The girl swallowed hard and shifted her arms, adjusting her hold on the baby. Jamal could see the struggle in her eyes, the exhaustion that weighed down her small frame. But she nodded again. Jamal exhaled sharply and turned toward the path leading away from the lake. His legs were already numb, his hands burning from the cold, but he ignored it. The only thing that mattered now was getting them somewhere safe. He glanced back once more, meeting the girl's eyes. "Come on." Without another word, she took a step forward, her arms still wrapped tightly around the baby. "Would you know what to do in a situation like this? Let's talk." Jamal lifted the baby, wrapping it in his jacket while helping the girl stand. His arms tightened around the infant, feeling the frail body against his chest. The baby barely moved, its breaths faint against the cold air. But as they moved, the ice beneath them cracked. A warning. Jamal froze, his grip tightening. The girl whimpered, her wide eyes darting toward him. "We can't go that way. The men are watching." Jamal scanned the area, his pulse quickening. In the distance, dark figures stood near a black van, their silhouettes barely visible through the falling snow. They weren't moving yet, but they were there, waiting. His stomach twisted. "Okay," he whispered, "we'll take the long way." The cold pressed in around them, sharp and unrelenting. Jamal's fingers ached, even beneath the layers of fabric. Every breath felt like ice scraping against his lungs. He glanced at the girl, her tiny frame trembling from exhaustion and fear. He didn't know how long she had been out here, but it had clearly been too long. The ice cracked again, this time louder. Jamal's heart pounded. He shifted his weight carefully, testing the ground beneath him. The girl took a step closer, gripping his sleeve, her fingers stiff from the cold. The baby stirred weakly against his chest, letting out a faint whimper. Jamal exhaled sharply, adjusting his hold. They had to move fast. He guided the girl toward the edge of the ice, keeping his steps light. His breath came in short, uneven bursts, his mind racing with every possible outcome. They couldn't afford a mistake. Behind them, the wind howled through the trees, masking their footsteps. The figures near the van had not moved, but Jamal knew they couldn't risk being seen. His eyes darted toward the far end of the lake, where the land sloped upward toward the trees. If they could make it there, they might have a chance. The girl tugged at his arm. "Are we going to make it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jamal hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, but we have to be careful." She swallowed hard, her eyes searching his face for reassurance. He didn't know if she found it, but she nodded anyway. He turned back toward the trees, his body tense with every step. His legs burned from the cold, but he forced himself to keep going. The baby's soft breaths were the only thing he could hear over the wind. The ice cracked once more, louder this time. A final warning. Jamal didn't wait. He tightened his grip on the baby and pulled the girl forward. "Run," he whispered. They moved as quickly as they could, each step careful but desperate. The edge of the ice was close now, just a few more steps. Jamal's chest tightened with anticipation. Almost there. "Would you risk running or stay hidden? Let's discuss." Holding the baby close, Jamal led the girl toward the trees. Every breath felt like fire in his lungs. The cold stung his face, his legs heavy with exhaustion, but he pushed forward. He had no choice. Behind them, a man shouted, "Hey, get back here!" Jamal's adrenaline kicked in. His grip tightened around the girl's hand. "Run!" The sound of boots crunching on ice made his stomach drop. They were getting closer. Jamal's pulse pounded in his ears. He couldn't stop. The trees loomed ahead, dark and thick, offering some cover. He veered left, pulling the girl along, weaving between trunks as the snow beneath their feet kicked up in bursts. His breath came in ragged gasps. The baby stirred, but it was still too weak to cry. The girl's grip on his hand never loosened, though he could hear her sobbing between frantic breaths. The wind howled, sending a chill straight through his bones. His legs felt heavy, but fear kept him moving. Each step felt like wading through deep snow, every muscle burning from the effort. He didn't know how much longer he could keep running. Behind them, the men's voices grew louder. They weren't far. Jamal clenched his jaw. He had to think. He had to move faster. A thick branch hung low ahead. Jamal ducked just in time, pulling the girl with him. He heard a curse from behind, the sound of a man stumbling. A few seconds gained, but was it enough? The baby shuddered against his chest. Its skin was ice cold. Jamal's stomach twisted. They had to find warmth soon. Just ahead, a road, headlights, a chance. Jamal burst from the trees, waving his arms frantically. "Stop! Help us! Do you think someone will stop? Or will they be ignored? Let's talk." A truck screeched to a halt, its tires skidding slightly on the icy road. The driver jumped out, his breath visible in the freezing air. "What's going on?" Jamal barely got the words out between gasps. "They need help. The baby, it's freezing." The driver took one look at the children, his expression shifting from confusion to urgency. Without hesitation, he pulled open the passenger door. "Get in. Now, we're going to the hospital." Jamal climbed in, cradling the baby close as the girl scrambled in beside him. The warmth of the truck was a stark contrast to the brutal cold outside, but the relief was short-lived. In the rearview mirror, Jamal saw the men stop at the tree line, watching, waiting. The girl clutched his sleeve, her fingers trembling. What if they come back? Jamal squeezed her hand, his jaw tightening. "I won't let them." The truck's engine roared as the driver hit the gas, the wheels spinning for a moment before gaining traction on the icy road. The cabin rattled slightly as they picked up speed, the headlights illuminating the dark stretch of highway ahead. Jamal exhaled, his breath still shaky. The fear was still there, clinging to his chest, refusing to let go. His fingers burned from the cold, even as warmth seeped into the cabin. His muscles ached, exhaustion threatening to pull him under, but he forced himself to stay alert. The girl remained silent beside him, her small fingers still wrapped around his sleeve. She wasn't crying, but her wide eyes stayed fixed on the window, watching the trees blur past. Her grip never loosened, as if letting go would somehow make everything real again. The baby stirred slightly against his chest, a weak sound escaping its lips. Jamal adjusted his hold, tightening the jacket around the tiny body, willing the warmth to reach it. Every second that passed felt like a countdown, and he couldn't shake the fear that they were already too late. The driver's hands gripped the wheel tightly, his eyes flicking toward the rearview mirror every few seconds. "Who are those men?" he asked, his voice low but firm. Jamal swallowed hard. "I don't know, but they were chasing us." The words felt heavier when spoken out loud. The reality of it all pressed down on him, the weight of the night settling deep in his bones. He didn't know who those men were, but he knew enough to be afraid of them. The girl shivered beside him, pulling the baby closer to her chest, as if she could shield him from everything that had happened. The infant barely stirred, its small breaths faint but steady. Jamal could still feel the cold radiating from its tiny body, a painful reminder of how close they had come to disaster. At the hospital, doctors rushed the baby into intensive care. The bright overhead lights and hurried voices filled the sterile halls as nurses moved swiftly. One doctor turned to Jamal, offering a small nod. "She'll be okay, thanks to you." Jamal exhaled, his chest still tight. The warmth of the hospital was a sharp contrast to the icy nightmare they had just escaped, but the tension in his body refused to fade. The little girl sat beside him, her small hands gripping the edge of the chair, her body still stiff with fear. Then the police arrived. An officer crouched beside the girl, his voice calm but firm. "Can you tell us what happened? Who left you on that lake?" The girl's lips trembled, but she didn't speak. Her eyes darted to Jamal, as if searching for reassurance. He gave her a small nod, silently telling her it was okay. Finally, her voice broke through the silence. "They took us from Mommy. We ran away." Jamal's chest tightened. His fingers curled into fists at his sides. "Who took you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The girl hesitated, her gaze dropping to her lap. Tears spilled down her cheeks, her small shoulders shaking. The officer's face remained neutral, but Jamal could see the tension in his eyes. The weight of what was about to be said pressed against them all, thick and suffocating. Then she looked up at the officer, her voice cracking. "The people who bought us." Silence. Jamal felt his stomach drop. The words hung in the air, heavier than anything he had ever heard. The beeping of distant monitors and the muffled voices in the hallway seemed distant, like background noise in a nightmare. The officer's jaw tightened. He exchanged a look with his partner, a silent conversation passing between them. One of the nurses near the doorway paused, her face pale, as she caught the girl's words. Jamal could feel his pulse in his ears. The girl wiped at her tears with the back of her hand, her fingers trembling. He wanted to tell her it was okay, that she was safe now, but the words stuck in his throat. Another officer stepped forward, voice gentle but steady. "Can you tell us who they were? Do you remember their names?" The girl's lips parted, but no sound came out. She shook her head quickly, shrinking back into the chair. Jamal clenched his fists. He had known something was wrong, but he hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected the cold reality settling over them all, as chilling as the frozen lake they had escaped from. The officer nodded. "It's okay. You're safe now. No one is going to hurt you." But Jamal wasn't so sure. He glanced toward the hospital entrance, half expecting to see shadows moving beyond the glass doors. The men from the lake, watching, waiting. The girl sniffled, curling her arms around herself. "What if they find us?" The officer crouched lower, his voice firm. "They won't. We'll make sure of it." The room remained heavy with silence, but Jamal could feel the shift. This wasn't over. It was only beginning. What do you think happens next? Let's discuss. Jamal's bravery saved 2 lives, but uncovered something far worse. With his help, the police launched an investigation, leading to a major trafficking bust. The case stretched farther than anyone had expected, revealing a hidden network that had stolen countless lives. Jamal's testimony, along with the little girl's, became the key to bringing them down. The girl and her baby sister were reunited with their mother, who had been searching for them. Their embrace, filled with tears and trembling hands, was a moment Jamal would never forget. For the first time, the little girl looked at peace, safe in the arms that had been waiting for her. Jamal watched as the mother clung to her daughters, whispering words he couldn't hear but could feel in the way her hands shook. The weight of everything they had been through pressed into that moment. The fear, the pain, and finally, relief. His chest tightened as he realized how close they had come to never making it back to her. The officers reassured the mother that the men responsible would be caught, that they would never be able to hurt another child again. But even as they spoke, Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that there was still more to be done. The shadows of what had happened would never fully disappear. The scars of fear in the little girl's eyes would take time to fade. As they prepared to leave, the little girl turned to Jamal, her eyes filled with gratitude. She reached for his hand, gripping it tightly for just a moment. "Thank you," she whispered. Jamal swallowed hard. He wasn't sure what to say, so he just nodded. He had done what he could, but somehow it didn't feel like enough. The world was still a dangerous place, and there were still so many others who might not be as lucky. As he stepped outside the hospital, the cold air stung his face, but it didn't feel the same as before. It wasn't just the frost that sent chills through him. It was the weight of knowing how close he had come to walking past them, to never knowing what had happened on that frozen lake. The thought made him shudder. He had learned that sometimes doing the right thing means changing lives forever. It wasn't just about one night, one moment. It was about standing up, even when it was terrifying. He hadn't set out to be a hero, but he had become one in ways he never imagined. The streets were quiet, the city lights glowing softly in the distance. Jamal took a deep breath and exhaled slowly. He didn't feel different, but he knew he was. The world looked the same, but he saw it differently now. He had stepped into something much bigger than himself, and he wasn't sure if he would ever see things the same way again. What's the biggest lesson from Jamal's story? Let's talk in the comments.